Welcome back, everyone, to the next episode of the Ask Evoke. I'm your host, Scott Johnston, and with me today is my good friend, Larry Goldie, coach for Ask Evoke and mountain guide. Larry and I have been climbing partners, ski buddies, and friends for over 25 years now. So, Larry, it looks like we've got some great questions today. Um, I know there's some that resonate really well with you, and there's others that I think I would like to tackle. But why don't we get started, dive right in? And thanks again for making the time to meet with me to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure for me to be here. And in addition to coaching at Evoke, I still listen to the Ask Evoke podcast, and I've been impressed with the quality of the questions that we're getting. The clearly people love listening and digesting this information. And even as coaches, some of these questions are really challenging for us to answer. So it's pretty
Yeah.
fun.
There's definitely a couple today that are kind of head scratchers, and there's one in particular I think we'll probably spend a fair bit of time on because it's pretty deep. Um, well, let me dive in with this first one because this is a really good question that I think will help or pertain to a lot of folks and people can get something from it. So this question is coming from Roger Cross, and he's saying, can muscular endurance be on a continual cycle of development and maintenance throughout the year, or do you recommend periods off from muscular development to just focus on non-sport specific aerobic fitness like in other traditional sports? If so, how long a break is typically recommended for an amateur alpine climber? For context, most of my climbing is in Yosemite and the High Sierra. So I think we as a group periodize our use of muscular endurance. I suppose it could potentially be done 52 weeks of the year, but I think most people will want to take a break from it, partly because the you know, if you're in a heavy muscular endurance training cycle, it's going to have a pretty significant deleterious effect on performance because you're going to be carrying around fatigue, pretty deep fatigue in the muscles, and you're not going to be able to perform at your highest level. That's the main reason we periodize it. We use it mostly in a base building period. Um, and in your case, this case from Roger, who's a rock climber, your muscular endurance training, while in the High Sierra, of course, there'll be some long approaches, and so doing some heavy weighted pack carries is probably beneficial. But if you're doing a lot of hard climbing and long routes in Yosemite, those themselves have a lot of high muscular load, and so some of your muscular endurance training is probably going to be doing upper body type muscular endurance work, pulling and pushing type exercises. And those are going to have a really significant effect on your ability to climb hard. So I would recommend, the way we periodize it is typically a base period of what we call max strength, which if you're familiar with our books, that should be pretty obvious. But we try to develop strength to its highest level using very conventional strength building techniques. And we do that in the principal propelling muscles. So for a runner, it's going to be a lot of work in the hip area and quadriceps, that sort of thing. But for a climber, it's going to be working the bigger pulling and pushing muscles. Then that strength building period will underlie the muscular endurance. It's going to be the base period leading into a muscular endurance training cycle. And I've never gone longer. And Larry, you tell me how long you have used it. But I think the longest muscular endurance cycle I have ever used with an athlete was about 16 weeks.
Mhm.
Um, Before either we were ready to shift gears into, let's say if we're talking about a runner, into more traditional, let's say uphill interval training. But I've never gone longer than that. but
Yeah.
not because I have any hard information that says it wouldn't work.
Yeah. Well, I've always liked that analogy uh, of muscular endurance is essentially like putting money into the bank. And especially for someone like an alpine climber, where the alpine season is going to be primarily spring through the fall, if they can spend, the fall and winter building muscular endurance and putting those deposits in, then they can use the alpine climbing season to start spending money out of the bank that they've made all those deposits in for so long. And I think I stole that analogy from you, but in my mind, that makes perfect sense. And uh, because they are such taxing workouts, that won't allow you to perform your best shortly after doing them. It's better to put the time in beforehand so that during the alpine climbing season you can benefit from all that work that you've done.
And just to be clear, I'm sure I stole that analogy from someone else too.
Okay.
So I, I didn't think of any of this stuff that we're talking about or that I've ever written about. I don't think I've had an original thought on any of these things,
I
um,
don't know, but
but anyway, I think that that's a really good point. You can't train hard and perform well at the same time. And muscular endurance training, by its very nature, it is fairly exhausting. And that's going to have a real significant effect on you. So I would cycle this if I were you. I think you'll see better results than just continually doing it. Um, so okay, well let's
right.
jump on to the next
Okay.
question then, Larry.
Okay, so the next question is from AC, and they ask how to balance training as both an alpine climber and ultra runner. Both require lots of volume and time. Uh, yeah, this is a good question. I feel like we do have a lot of athletes that like to perform in multiple athletic endeavors. And, for almost all of us, we're amateur athletes. Nobody's paying us to train. We're not training for the Olympics or we're not fully sponsored. So there's always going to be this balance of just not having enough time with all the other demands of work and family and and life. And so, given that, we're going to have to form some sort of compromise and decide where we want to allocate our time. I think in this particular blending, alpine climbing and ultra running have uh, a lot of things in common, right? So alpine climbing, you need to have a huge aerobic base so that on the approaches, when you're carrying a heavy pack, you're not going to be super fatigued when it comes time for some more difficult alpine climbing. They're both, very aerobic events. So I would say that the alpine climber could do a lot of their aerobic base training by running and especially running in the mountains and with a lot of elevation gain. I think it's been pretty well demonstrated that the alpine climber doesn't need to do a huge amount of rucking or carrying around a heavy pack to still be quite effective when they do go into the mountains and wind up carrying a heavy pack. So you could build a huge aerobic base by doing a lot of running. And I think given time constraints, I would tend to focus a little bit more on my strength training toward upper body and, more climbing specific training if I was trying to maximize my time. And then I think the other thing that could work really well is, you know, we don't have a lot of information from AC on the background of the question, but if this, as an ultra runner, there were certain races that you were targeting, it would be ideal if those races weren't right in the middle of your alpine climbing season. If you could, have your alpine climbing season and then maybe have, a month or two to shift gears to sort of fine tune your running, get some intensity work in before the big ultra run. That could be a way to balance those two training goals. Scott, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, those are all really useful tips, I think. One of the things I have discovered with runners that like to climb is we will often use like a hard gym bouldering session as a recovery workout from a run. And so um, you're not going to probably perform at your best in the bouldering session that evening after going for a 3 or 4 hour run in the morning, but it does really doing high strength. It would be like going into the gym and lifting heavy weights, doing a heavy bouldering session. So, we're talking, routes that are, 4 to 10 moves long, and where the effort and the power development, the force developments are very high, that has a recovery type of an effect. So I've used that before with people that like to do both these things. Now, on the flip side of that coin, what I would say is that if you are like if you're wanting to climb hard, let's say you're in a season where climbing is more important than the running, do the hard training, hard climbing in the morning when you're fresh, and then
Okay.
do the aerobic, the relatively easier aerobic work later in the day. I mean, there's nothing, I mean, doing, let's say, base building, aerobic base building, zone two type training when you're a little tired, that's not going to have a negative effect on the workout. Whereas, trying to climb hard when you're tired, you're not going to be able to climb hard. So the workout's not going to be as productive.
Right.
I wouldn't try to do a high quality climbing session and a high quality, running session in the same day. That's going to be a problem for you.
Yep.
So, and I think you've made a really good point. It's just there's going to be a compromise here for this person. Anybody who's trying to do two things, even though these both of these things rely pretty heavily on the aerobic capacity of the athlete, they have, especially the climbing part of it. It's a high skill sport, and if you need to spend a lot of time developing those skills, and that's going to conflict with the amount of time you have to to develop the aerobic base for running well in long distance. So just be aware that you're not going to be standing on the top of the podium probably in either one of these events.
Right.
So be satisfied with that as a compromise. I mean, there's nothing wrong with compromise. Most of us live our lives with this kind of compromise where we just realize that's what it's going to be. So that would be my only 2 cents on that.
Yeah. Great.
Um, well, here's
All
another one
right.
I think would be good for you to dive into.
Okay. Let's see. So T Hunter has asked, what are the best ways to enhance the speed and effectiveness of recovery on a day-to-day basis? Uh, I think one of the best ways to speed recovery is honestly is just to so when we work out, one of the main things that happens, this is true with a long aerobic workout or a strength workout, we're depleting our muscles of glycogen, right? And that triggers a training stimulus. So if we can replenish that as soon as possible after we eat, I've heard it said there's a 20 to 30 minute window, but as soon as we can get some fuel into our bodies that our muscles can absorb and start to replenish, repair, that's in my experience one of the quickest ways to recover and be ready to go right afterwards. I think especially with strength work. Getting some protein in can also really help the muscles rebuild any little tears. And these little micro tears are happening, whether we're running downhill and pounding through our bodies or lifting heavy weights. Uh, but yeah, fuel in the form of food is what helps our body repair, and that's one of the best ways we recover. So I think that's a really easy trick. I often tell my athletes, just make sure after a big day you have food in the car so you don't have to drive half an hour from the trailhead before you can start replenishing. Or using some kind of protein-rich recovery shake right after a workout is really good. I know for me personally, I've started doing that all the time. Immediately after a strength workout, I have a recovery shake, and then I drive home and, I'll try to eat a meal, and I find that it dramatically improves my recovery. Uh,
Yeah, I think intraday, intraday, I should say, that fueling is the number one. I've certainly, there's going to be a delayed recovery um, if you're not fueling adequately, and that so much literature on what fueling adequately is, and the science is changing all the time. But you probably have felt this. You do some kind of a workout. Maybe it's just a run, it's go ski touring or whatever it is, doesn't matter. And you don't fuel adequately. And you'll feel that kind of heavy dead legs feeling sometimes for 2 or 3 days if you don't fuel soon and adequately. Um, and you can even experiment with this. Like if you have that heavy dead leg feeling, let's say you did this big workout on a Monday morning, well, on Tuesday, you're still feeling that with your legs. Try eating a lot Tuesday and notice that I'll bet you late Tuesday, you're going to start, oh yeah, my legs actually feel better now. And
yeah.
that's an indication that the main fatigue, the fatigue you were feeling in your legs is probably principally coming from that glycogen depletion that Larry's been talking about.
Well,
But
and
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, no, I was going to say one of our coaches just shared a study that came out about how after a period of heavy exertion, I know I felt this like when I come out of, a 3 or 4 day trip in the mountains and I have a recovery day afterwards, I am famished all that day,
Mhm.
much more hungry than normal, even though I'm not doing a thing. And this study was with some ultra runners that showed how the basal metabolic rate stayed elevated for several days after a big event. And the first 24 hours and could be, 3 times your normal basal metabolic rate. So to me, that just shows that your body needs fuel even after
Yeah.
you've finished. And yeah, on a climbing trip in the mountains, it might be a couple days where your body's like, no, 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 I need more fuel to help recover.
Yeah, I'm going to give an example of this, probably a bad example. I'm using myself as a bad example. So about, let's see, a week ago, Monday, I went into the mountains to try to climb this particular mountain car to car in a day. Um, I didn't succeed only because when I got to the actual fifth class part of the route, it started to rain and there were parties above me knocking rocks down. And I thought, well, this is not a smart thing. Even though I had spent 6.5 hours getting to that spot,
Yeah.
I had to turn around and head home, which was a good idea because the clouds dropped down. I could barely see where I was going. And it was a 13-hour day.
Wow.
And
Up the climb.
I ate during the day, as much as you can reasonably carry with you when you're, trying to go fast. I just was in, running shoes and shorts and a t-shirt basically. Um, and when I got back to my car, I started to eat again there, but I don't think I ate enough. And I was struggling all last week, feeling like pretty hammered. Granted, 13-hour day for me at my age, especially, is a pretty huge day. But I noticed that, and it wasn't until actually, I think, today, a week later, that
Yeah.
we're recording this on a Monday, that I finally went, oh, I actually feel like I could go for a run today and feel pretty decent. And so that study you just mentioned, Larry, came from I think it's called Montana Running is the place that
Hmm.
that put it out. And when I read it, I thought, oh yeah, that was probably what the stupid thing I did last week was just I didn't give myself enough credit for the amount of work I'd done during those 13 hours.
Yeah.
And so I probably needed to really pound the calories the whole rest of the week in order to, I could have recovered probably several days earlier if I had been paid more attention to that. Um,
Yeah.
So that's my bad example. Don't do what
Yeah.
I did. Um,
Yeah. Well, according to that study, a week later, your basal metabolic rate is still significantly elevated from normal, from just,
yeah.
you know, and this is like with fairly active individuals when you have a huge event like that, like 13-hour day, moving through the mountains, a lot of elevation gain, or an ultra race. So yeah, I think it's not to be underestimated, and it's not, that 20-minute window is for your normal daily hour and a half workout. Whereas, if you go put in a 13-hour day, it's going to be days where you're really needing to refuel those muscles.
Yeah. I mean, I would have never given one of my athletes the same advice that I just gave myself. So yeah, do what I say, don't do what I do.
Yeah,
But the other thing on the inter-day scale is sleep. I mean, I think
yep,
we can't leave this subject without talking about sleep because sleep is when most of the recovery from the damage we do to ourselves through exercise is repaired. And without adequate deep sleep, REM type sleep, you're not going to be recovering well. So you can't short yourself on sleep. It's not healthy, but it's certainly going to have a very significant impact on your ability to handle much of a training load.
yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think just for maintaining day-to-day life, sleep is such an important thing.
Yeah. I get grumpy when I don't sleep enough too.
Yeah,
So,
likewise. Yeah, well, and
um,
I notice it in my guests up in the mountains when we, hike up to a camp, do an alpine start the next day for a summit. And so we're only sleeping for a few hours, climb to the summit, come back. If you have to hike out that day, people are extra fatigued. But even after a second night where they're getting closer to a full night's sleep, uh, you can see there's some accumulated fatigue that happened because they just are in a deficit from the
yeah,
alpine start.
yeah, for sure. Okay, this next question is the one that I think we may spend a little more time talking about because it's one that's close to our hearts, but is a challenging one to answer, and that is coming from someone I think Jen Tam is their Instagram name. So it says, "How has AI shaped or changed the way you coach, if at all?" Well, the short answer would be that it has not changed the way any of us coach at all. But I think there's a lot to be said about this. I think everyone who's alive today, certainly in the Western world where we're exposed to this type of thing a lot, is becoming more and more aware of the impact that AI is having on our lives. And without getting into some deeper moral questions and that sort of thing, I think just talking about the utility of it from as it relates to coaching, I'm going to give my 2 cents here, Larry, and then I want you to chime in or stop me
Yeah,
on
sure.
the way if there's something that you feel like needs to be countered or reinforced. But we value very strongly the human to human interaction we have with our athletes. Now, most people who are listening to this know that we use a third-party platform called Training Peaks, which allows us to collect a great deal of data. They have some very effective algorithms to parse the data that's coming from the athlete's GPS heart rate monitor. And so we're able to look at that data for every single day of training for the athlete. And that's a pretty cool tool to have. I mean, and I think they're probably preparing to integrate some AI into that algorithm, I would imagine. However, we rely as heavily, if not more heavily, on the coach or the comments that the athlete leaves in Training Peaks after they've done this workout as we do the data that's shared in there. And I believe strongly that it's without the combination of the sort of subjective comments that we're getting from the athlete and the data, we would not be able to coach effectively long distance like we have done so successfully all these years. So it's really, and I actually do outweigh, or I weigh the comment stronger than I do the data.
Yeah.
If the data tells me one thing and the athletes tells me something that's diametrically opposed, I am going to do a deeper dive with the athlete into, okay, why did you feel so good, or why do you feel so bad about this, that what you did today? Um, and I
Well,
think that, oh, go ahead, Larry.
oh, I
Yeah.
was just going to jump in right there and say I would totally agree. We look at all those metrics and then compare them to what we're hearing from our athletes. And there's a lot of times where they line up quite well, and
Mhm.
that gives me more confidence in those metrics. But there are other times where, the athlete feels incredibly tired, super fatigued, no energy, and I'm not seeing that in the metrics in any way. And you drill down a little bit deeper, and uh, you encourage them, okay, look, I think you need to back off. I'm not sure what's going on. Maybe you're getting sick. And then sure enough, a day or two later, they've got the flu or something comes down. And so I don't feel like just relying on the metrics is 100% reliable. I feel like, the importance of that human to human interaction is so critical for what we do.
Yeah, there's been a couple of, there are actually some apps out there now. There's one that I could remember the name of, but it deals primarily, it's designed for triathletes. And it uses AI to evaluate your current status on any given day in terms of your preparedness to do the training that's programmed for the day. And the way it works is it looks at your heart rate variability during your warm up. And then it makes a decision about, okay, are you prepared to do this interval workout or whatever that's been designed, or should we take a day off, or that sort of thing? And while I have had my gripes about using heart rate variability as a single metric for evaluating preparedness to train, it has come a long way since I first began to play around with it 15 years ago. Um, and so I think that that is probably the best system I have seen. The problem with it is, from what I could tell, the way it was designed, though the way I read about this particular program, was that it relies exclusively on this heart rate variability. So you're making the decision based off of one thing. And what I have seen long term with heart rate variability is it's a great, if you're looking at backcasting, looking at or hindcasting, looking at what has happened, you'll often see really good correlation between heart rate variability and the athlete's training effect and preparedness to train. But for forecasting, it can be, maybe it's 90%, correlates about 90% with the feelings of the athlete. But that 10%, that's a pretty significant error that hopefully the coach can override through these kind of comments and this in back and forth with the athlete, which we do regularly. We communicate with our athletes via through Training Peaks with this comment section that I was just talking about, but we also do it through, text and phone calls and emails, that sort of thing. And the thing that I think that at this point with the development of AI, and I'm very far from any kind of an expert on AI, um, at this point, the thing that I think really sets a coach apart from a machine is that the coach has the ability to empathize. And the coach, not being another human being, we understand emotions, we understand the psychology, we understand that life gets in the way. Maybe you've had a fight with your spouse, or there's all kinds of things that interact that come into play when we're talking about the body's ability to handle stress. And at this point, I can't imagine, I mean, maybe it's out there, but I can't imagine that there is a machine that can be that empathetic or can have that kind of emotional attachment that another human being can have. So I guess that would be, at this point, my feeling about the downside of trying to rely heavily on AI for
Yeah.
coaching.
I do feel we're living through a time where people are increasingly trying to, record everything, how much time they sleep, how much time they're in deep sleep and REM sleep. And, we wear watches and rings to monitor our heart rate 24/7. And, we're a little, at the risk of sounding like a Luddite, a little overly data driven by some of these things. And uh, I think it's important that you just mentioned stress, that, you know, different types of stress can affect the body the same way, whether it's stress from, things going wrong at work, trying to meet a deadline on a big project, or, your child having a stomach bug and throwing up all night, or getting in a fight with your spouse, or, doing really hard training workouts. A lot of those things can all, they're all stress on your body. Uh, that manifest in different ways. And so I don't think just relying on the data that comes through some kind of device where we're tracking our heart rate variability or how much time we've slept can at this point paint the whole picture. And I do think it takes a human to interact and uh, help people make decisions on whether or not they should train this day or whether or not they need more recovery.
Yeah, it's certainly one of it's the reason we are in essentially daily contact with our athletes, with every single athlete. We are touching base with them, as much as humanly possible on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And it's because in my experience as a coach for many, many years, it's that communication that is what, first of all, you build trust, you have a bond with the person, and it's what allows you to go beyond the data. But I would agree with you, Larry. I think we have the technology now to collect all this amazing volume of data on so many aspects. But the problem with that is we are such a complex system that no single piece of that data tells the whole story. And it's easy to, I know this from my background in mathematics, is that when we're dealing with complexity, and this is different than complicated. Complicated is like your toaster. It's kind
Yeah.
of a complicated device, but it adheres to some very strict rules and laws that we can define, or even your automobile, which is a fairly complicated, quite a complicated thing, but we can understand all of the complications in that machine. But when it comes to dealing with whether it's weather or economics or human psychology, these are incredibly complex systems. And the only way we, with our puny little brains, can understand them is to create models for these complex systems. And as I like to quote the famous mathematician George Box, all models are wrong. Some are useful.
Yeah.
And so, like, no matter how elaborate of a model you build for a complex system, it is not going to be the same as that system. It will not be perfect
Yeah.
because the complexity, by virtue of its very nature, complexity means you can't quantify some parts of it. And I think that's one of the problems with machines. And I would categorize, AI as essentially a machine, is that it's trying to build a model that helps it. And the model gets you pretty close in many cases. But it's my belief with coaching, like I'm going to relate a little story recently with, as many people know, we've had some athletes that have performed very well recently in some races. And there's been some question about should we be revealing the details of their training publicly? And then that's a great debatable question. Is it like how close do we keep the cards to our chest? Because we have spent years and years developing some of these techniques. And what I have come to believe about that is sharing an individual workout or whatever, that's not very important because coaching is all of the nuance around the edges of that workout. Just telling somebody to go to the track and do such and such a workout, or that's such a small piece of the overall coaching puzzle. And that's what I'm afraid that the machine is going to do is say, okay, you need to go. The machine has enough knowledge to say, okay, if you want to develop this quality, you need to go do this type of training. But it's again, that the nuance, the subtleties that are embedded into the coach athlete relationship that I think really set it apart from, whether it's just a stock training plan or being told what to do by a machine.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. I think your point about the complexity relies on there's a ton of different variables that go into how a person is feeling on any given day. And sometimes we don't even know what those variables are. And I think
Yeah.
that's the problem with a model. You not only don't you know how heavily to weight certain variables, you don't even know what variables are in play.
Yeah.
Whereas at least the coach can dig down and try to get to the bottom of what else might be at play.
Yeah.
And
And that's what
certainly
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say with the athletes that I coach, we are in that daily discussion where I'm asking them lots of questions. They're responding to me with how they feel. And anytime a workout comes through with no comment, I'll inevitably write back, how'd you feel on this one? How did this go? I need that information to know where we're going next. And even the people that we write custom plans for, where I'm not checking in on those athletes every day, I really encourage them to use Training Peaks like a training journal. And after they do the workouts that I program 6 weeks in advance, to put some comments in about how they're feeling. So if they want me to write them another plan, I can go back and look and see, their progress through. Uh,
Yeah.
and I find that's really, really helpful.
And that's one of the issues I think with self-coaching, that self-coaching is incredibly hard to do. I coach some quite high-level athletes who are completely capable of designing a training plan for themselves, but they're still relying on this coach athlete partnership that we have to kick ideas around, to discuss, like, why do I feel kind of crappy today? And let's look back at what you did 4 days ago. Maybe we're still feeling some fatigue from that. Um, so I guess we've given it the long answer now, but the short answer is it has not affected our coaching at all at this point. And I hope for humanity's sake, it doesn't affect our coaching going forward because
Yeah.
I'm a little bit nervous about, no, I mean, I'm quite nervous about where this could lead us all. Um, okay, uh, next question. Um, and this is an interesting one, but I might be a little challenged to answer it the way this person has asked. And that is, what would you consider exceptional weekly zone two mileage for the tactical athlete? Well, the word exceptional is what I'm struggling with. I'm not sure if you mean acceptable or exceptional. Exceptional to me would mean like what's the maximum amount I should be potentially doing, whereas acceptable to me would mean what's the minimum amount I should be doing. So maybe we should tackle this with the range. Um, so one of the problems with tactical athletes is they're involved in you know I mean, whether it's I would assume it's military because that's who we deal primarily with. So I would assume that's this person. That's another, like the alpine climber, that's another very high skill type of activity. and it's got a whole bunch of tactical skills that the athlete needs to be training for. So that reduces their amount of time that they can be spending doing this type of aerobic based training. What we have seen over the years for as a kind of I would call a minimum dosage to really move the zone 2 needle is going to be somewhere in the 4 to 6 hours of aerobic work in a week before you'll start to see um, significant or real changes in aerobic capacity. Now, many people are going to be limited by that. So they what you can unfortunately there's no shortcut. And I would love it if we could say, oh yeah, well you could just do this workout and it don't only you don't need to do 4 hours. You can only do only need to do 2 hours a week. But we have just seen that in order to really make a difference, and it depends, of course, on your genetics, your training background, um, and that sort of thing. And age is another big factor. Young person is going to respond much more quickly to this. People that are genetically predisposed towards developing endurance will respond more quickly. Um, so I would say that if I look at the exceptional mileage, I would say you don't need to be doing more than, 10 hours a week. And if I was looking at the acceptable end or the minimum, I would say, probably 2 to 3 hours a week is probably the bare minimum that I would recommend. Um, so I hope
Yeah, and
that's of help to this person.
similar to what we spoke about earlier in terms of balancing this out, if there are other demands or training portions of your day, trying to take on the things that take the fine motor skills, whether it's marksmanship or, hand-to-hand combat, that would be better done first before putting in that kind of daily aerobic based training.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's one of the first things that diminishes with central nervous system fatigue, which is the type of fatigue, that's the dominant type of fatigue that endurance athletes encounter because of the repetitive nature, making the same movements, thousands and thousands of times, sometimes in a workout. And that causes a fatigue in the motor nervous system where the nerves basically become tired. They can't fire those muscles anymore. And the first thing that happens with deep central nervous system fatigue is a degradation in fine motor skills. So we've done testing with military athletes, well, actually with Army Rangers, a group of 100 of them. And if anybody wants to read, there's a detailed analysis of this study we did in the military section on our website. But I think it's interesting for any kind of endurance athlete. But basically, what these guys did is they shot the marksmanship test, then they carried a heavy pack for 12 miles, what they call rucking for 12 miles, and they came back to the range and shot again the same exact marksmanship test. And what they saw was the people who were the fastest on the rucking, so probably had the highest aerobic capacity, had the least degradation in their shooting skills from before to after the rucking. And this is something we have emphasized in our work with the military now for several years, is if we can improve an athlete's aerobic capacity, then they're going to be able to do fine motor skills. Same thing we could think about for an alpine climber. If you exhaust yourself getting to the crux of the climb, when you need to be able to develop high power and good careful foot placements on small holds, those are the skills that are going to have deteriorated because of the stress from the central nervous system fatigue that came from this difficult approach. So all of this pertains really quite well to all the kind of endurance athletes we work with. Um, so getting that base aerobic base, this is why it's so important, is to you can diminish the central nervous system fatigue slightly. Um, there was still in this case, there was still a degradation in shooting marksmanship. Nobody got better after they rucked. They
Right.
all had a deterioration, but there was a less of a deterioration in the aerobically fit group. And it was actually quite we even have a graph of it on the website you can find in that military section. I'll have, when we post this, I'll have Dave put a link to that article in the show notes so people could go read it if they so choose. Um, so anyway, I hope that answered that. Um, Next question is challenging. I want
Oh,
to challenge, not challenging for me, but challenging for this person. This person wants to train hard, but they also want to donate blood frequently, which is noble of you, and I commend you for doing that. But that is going to definitely have a pretty big impact on your ability to train hard. As you hopefully everybody who's listening to this understands, it's the volume of the hemoglobin in your blood that's carrying the oxygen to the working muscles that is vital to your ability to perform tasks, any tasks, but certainly endurance related tasks. And so and when you drain a liter of blood out of your body, and maybe, most of us have somewhere in the range of 5 or 6 liters of blood, that's a pretty big chunk, and a unit is a liter. When they take a unit of blood out of you, that's a liter of blood, as far as I understand it. So now let's say you had 5 liters of blood, or 5 liters of oxygen carrying capacity. Your oxygen carrying capacity for several weeks is going to be diminished by, what's that, 20%. Um, so that is going to dramatically affect your ability to perform any kind of endurance work, but especially hard, high intensity work. So I would say that don't want to be doing blood donations during heavy training periods. Maybe you want to do that in your off season or in the beginning of your base period. You certainly would not want to be doing it close to an important event. And by close, from my understanding, is that the red blood cell replenishment is on the order of weeks. I don't know if you know any better, Larry. I'm certainly not a doctor. Don't pretend to be. Um, but I think it is somewhere in the order of weeks. So
yeah.
you wouldn't want to be doing this blood draw within a few weeks of an important event.
Yeah, I would think a month. And certainly at the beginning of a recovery week would be a perfect time where your training volume is normally gonna taper off for a little while. And then again, as you mentioned, Scott, just where maybe you're just in a base building period, you don't have any super difficult workouts or you know, demanding high level of performance for the following coming weeks.
Yeah. But good on you for doing
Yeah,
that.
well, and this is why, like in the Tour de France, blood doping was such an effective way of performing better, right? When these athletes were
Yeah.
so depleted and they could suddenly get a transfusion with their blood that was taken out at a peak training period. It was such a dramatic benefit for these guys to then be able to, you know, go right back out there and perform at a super high level. So you
Yeah.
can imagine donating blood is going to have the opposite effect of taking away your ability to perform at that high
Sure.
level.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, on a personal level, in the 80s, and even the 70s and the 80s, blood doping in endurance sports was not illegal. And there were countries and athletes that were using blood doping back then. And we don't know for sure who they were, but there was instances that are kind of alarming to see how well people could perform. And I had two little stories about this. One that I experienced when I was ski racing on the World Cup level. There was a Finnish guy whose name I barely can even remember. I'll probably mispronounce it, so I won't even say it. Um, who was kind of back in the middle of the field with me, 30th place in a race. And I remember that one particular race, like 2 weeks before the World Championships, he was back there knocking heads with me in 30th place. 2 weeks later at World Championships, he won a gold medal. Now, how did
Whoa.
that happen? That's where blood doping could really pay off. Ben Huseby, one of our other coaches, who was had a much more successful cross country ski racing career than I did, tells a story one time at the Olympics. This Murillo Desolt, a very famous Italian skier who had been performing worse than Ben in World Cup races leading up to the Olympics. First race at the Olympics was a shorter race. I think it was a 10 kilometer. And Desolt was like way out of the contention, maybe 20th or so place. And he disappeared from the compound, the Olympic compound, for several days. And then he came back and he won the 50-kilometer race, 10 days later. And so there are instances of that happening, and in some cases, but I don't think blood doping in those times. Well, I think when Ben was racing in the 90s, blood doping was illegal, but when I was racing in the early 80s, it I don't think it was controlled or even probably wasn't even illegal. But that's what just shows you the dramatic effect of boosting the amount of hemoglobin or hematocrit you have in your blood, red blood cells, which is what carries the oxygen, versus draining away some of them like this person is doing. Um, so,
Yeah.
okay.
All right, next question. This is from Pursuer of Light. And they ask, how can I be sure that my weekly training volume is enough, not too little, not too much? Well, that's a little bit open-ended of a question, but I would say to just sort of step back a little bit. One thing that we tell folks all the time when we're talking about training in general is that for training to be effective, it should be gradual, it should be progressive, and there should be some modulation involved. So by that, I would say, in an ideal world, your weekly training volume from one week should increase the next week, should increase the following week, and kind of build upon itself so your body can get used to this progression. And then after a number of weeks, backing off for a recovery week. And I know a lot of our, athletes that are type A people that just feel like more is always better, struggle with these weeks to back off. But, Scott, you've written about it probably as much as anyone in the history of training, just
Mhm.
the importance of recovery and how those are the times that people get stronger. And those weeks are so important in the overall training. Uh, they're so beneficial. And I see this all the time with my athletes where after a recovery week, the following week, when they start training harder again, the comments are like, oh my God, I feel so good right now. I feel great. I could have ran for twice as long. We get a lot of those comments because they're rested and fully recovered and they're ready to start taking on higher training volume again. Uh, so that's a little bit big picture. So one thing I would say to try to answer the question enough to be sure that the weekly training volume is enough is that after 3 or 4 weeks, when you're ready for that recovery week, you're feeling like, ooh, I'm tired. I am ready for a recovery week. And fatigue is something that every endurance athlete, lives with a lot of the time. So it's sort of this constant companion, and it's going to be building up week after week as you increase that training volume. And so when you're ready for your recovery week, you should feel ready for it. If you feel like, oh man, I could just keep going and going and going, then it's perhaps that your training volume is not high enough. Uh, Midweek, I often, when people are trying to figure out if they're doing enough or not too much, one of the things we look at again is related to recovery and whether or not they feel recovered by the next day, to do the workout again. So could you do the yesterday's workout again tomorrow? Uh, if the answer is no, you're not recovered from that workout, then you may be pushing too high of a training volume, or training at too high of an intensity. But if you feel like, yeah, I think, I could do that again tomorrow, and I know I'm going to be tired, but, I can maintain this, then you're probably at approximately the right volume. Scott, what would you
I
add to
think,
that?
well, one thing I would say is I like to use training load versus volume because
Mhm.
that's a
Great.
more, I mean, both of these are somewhat, well, training volume can be quite precise in terms of the hours or the mileage or whatever. Training load is a little more challenging to put a number to. But it's one of the reasons we use Training Peaks and the metrics at Training Peaks because we actually monitor we monitor the volume or the time spent, but we also monitor the actual load because that will vary depending on the amount of, the elevation gain and loss or the intensity of the workouts. That'll change the training load. So I would say, first of all, we should want to, I would say that use the term load as a more accurate way of discussing this issue. But the big thing is, I say, is are you getting better? Are you getting fitter? If you're not getting fitter and you're really tired, then it's quite clear that you're not if you're not seeing fitness gains on a let's say 2 to 4 week scale, um, and you're tired, then you're doing too much. If you're not seeing fitness gains on a 2 to 4 week scale and you're fresh as a daisy, then you're probably just not doing enough. But measuring, I mean, the whole goal of training is to improve our fitness. And this could be weightlifting, it could be running, it could be climbing, it doesn't matter. We're trying to become better at what we're training to do. So if you're not seeing gains, and my experience has led me to say that most of the time when people don't see gains, it's because they're doing too much, not too little. Because most of the people that are, as you've already alluded to at one point in our today's talk, Larry, most of the people that are attracted to these kinds of sports are already kind of type A, more is always going to be better. And so they tend to overdo it. And so they'll tend to be tired enough when they're adding more training load on top of a fatigue load that they're still carrying that their body just can't perform. And so they don't see the gains. And that's where this modulation that Larry was talking about a moment ago is you need some hard days and some easy days. You need some hard weeks and you need some easy weeks. Um, and you need to be like at some point during the training cycle, you need to be able to, I believe, from a motivation standpoint, is see results. Even if it's just on an easy zone 1 or zone 2 run you do, and you need to be able to go, wow, I'm 3 minutes faster to that rock today than I have been historically in the past. And when you can do that, then you go, okay, the training is working. Whereas if, on the other hand, if you go, I was working pretty hard today and I'm 4 minutes slower to that rock, then I'm overdoing things here. I need, if I'm carrying enough fatigue that it's really impacting my performance. And
Yeah.
that fatigue means you're not able to absorb the new training load. So, your body can only absorb the stress of training if it's prepared. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about heart rate variability, that's noticing or being able to um, understand your preparedness to do more, add more stress on your body is critical to this. It's like if you're warming up and you're going, boy, I'm just feeling really terrible today, then that's a day you should go home and take a rest. You're just don't try to force that because your body can't absorb more stress. Putting more stress on it just has a negative effect rather than a positive adaptation.
Yeah. Yeah. The only other thing I would add to that is just people need to realize that because we're not machines, that training isn't always this perfectly linear line.
Oh yeah.
In the 2 to 4 week time period that you mentioned, ultimately we want to be improving, but you're not always going to beat your time to the rock every time you go to the rock, right? It
Yes.
doesn't
Yeah.
work that way. You're going to have ups and downs throughout the way. But so we don't look at data points as much as we look at the trend line through those data points. And I
Yeah.
think that's an important distinction. I sometimes have athletes that are so disappointed on one workout because, it took them a little longer to get to the top of, their weekly training hike. And it's like, they're still far faster than when we started training together. And that's
Hmm.
what they need to be. But you're not going to get PRs every time you go out. And I don't think you should expect to.
Definitely not. Yeah, I've seen that over and over again that there's a tendency to think that there's this sort of magic bullet and that it's going to happen every time you go out the door. But I think that we want to measure ourselves by our best performances. Not, I mean, we're identifying as an athlete, we're identified as an athlete by way of our best performances, not our worst performances. Everyone's going to have bad days, or whether it's, who knows why you have a bad day. There's multiple reasons, but those bad days do not define you unless they start to be every day is a bad day. Then
Yes.
that's when you need to take some drastic steps. But what really defines you as an athlete and what shows you your potential and your performance is on those good days. And you need to give yourself a big pat on the back on those good days and generally disregard the bad days. And again, unless they become really frequent. Um, Years and years ago when I was coaching these junior skiers and we didn't have anything, most of them didn't have heart monitors. We certainly didn't have anything like training peaks. I asked them to grade each workout on a scale of A through F. And if they saw more than two C's or a D in a week, then they needed to let me know. So we would say, okay, today you're gonna, you had two D's this week. Hey, let's take a break. Let's really dial back. An F would mean you couldn't finish the workout. But that's a very simple way of gauging, am I getting better or am I just beating on myself to no gain?
Right.
Well, this same person has asked us another question here, and again, a little bit vague. I'll try to do my best with this. What's the difference between training for a 50-kilometer and a 25-kilometer race, Golden Trail Series race? Well, it depends on the nature of that race, and it depends on your history as an athlete and experience in these types of races. Um, you know, if you are, like, for instance, how much vertical is involved? Is this a flatter, faster race? Is this a very hilly race? Those are going to involve different types of training. Now, obviously, running 25 kilometers versus 50 kilometers, the if everything else being equal, the 25-kilometer race is going to be competed at a faster pace. So that would indicate you probably need to be doing some more fast running than you would. If one of these races is especially hilly, then that would mean you're going to shift gears to doing more vertical and maybe more muscular endurance type work. So I'm afraid that your question is vague enough that I can't give you much more specific answer than what I just did. Any thoughts on that, Larry?
No, I would agree with you on that. Yeah, it's hard to know the different character of the races. Mm, yeah.
Well, let's jump into this next one. It's a motivational one.
Yeah. Hi, Scott and Larry. I would love to hear your thoughts on how to deal with the loss of motivation. This year, I followed the 24-week mountaineering plan to prepare for a trip to the Alps to climb the Monk, the Jungfrau, and Eiger. Unfortunately, due to weather and hut logistics, we only climbed the Monk and spent the trip hiking in the valley. Since we got back, I noticed I'm not excited about mountaineering anymore. Normally in the summer, I'm all about climbing as many mountains as possible. At first, I thought I was just tired from the trip, but it's been 4 weeks and I still don't feel up to a big alpine climb. Both of you have been climbing mountains for a long time. Has this ever happened to you? As always, thanks for taking my question and all the great info. This is from Brandon. Uh, yeah, this, this is a really interesting question. Uh, I think everyone has different sources of motivation. And, when it comes to climbing mountains, it can be a really personal thing. Some people just like the quality of the time they're spending in the mountains, just stepping away from technology and our everyday life. I think some people really like the simplicity of, you know, choosing a goal, giving everything we have, physically and preparing and mentally to take on the challenges that are required to do this climb. And then it's pretty black and white of whether or not we have a successful outcome of achieving that goal. What did you make it to the top of the mountain or not? And that's quite different than did you have a good trip? I just want to make the caveat there. But ultimately, certainly one thing I talk to a lot of my athletes about is this idea that when it comes to training, you have to enjoy the training because you're going to spend so many more hours training for a trip. And this could be even an expedition to the Himalaya where you're going to be for months. Uh, you're going to spend many more hours training for this event than you're going to spend on the event itself. So you have to find some kind of enjoyment in the process of just being out there doing the work day to day. Uh, this kind of loss of motivation sometimes will happen to people even when they come back from a successful expedition, their dream climb that they've always wanted to do. They come back and there's this real sort of letdown. And one thing we often tell people is just to give yourself a little time to take a break and do all of the other things in your life that you've been neglecting for so long. So I know for me personally, after, big trips, I've taken some time away from climbing and I've focused on either mountain biking, something that is not incredibly beneficial to get you prepared for the rigors of alpine climbing. Trail running or just, spending time with my family out on the lake, supping, the kind of things that I had to deprioritize during my intense training blocks. And then in terms of helping me just find my love for the mountains again, uh, honestly, when that sort of thing has happened to me, it's often because the stress of the climbs was kind of so intense that I just needed a little break, like, particularly on big and, dangerous climbs. Scott, you and I have had a few of those together. I can think of the Jervasuti Pillar in particular, where I came down from that, and I was little, physically it was quite difficult, but it was also mentally really draining. And you just feel like I can't go do that again for a while. Like that's the kind of thing I can do a couple times a year at most. And so for me, just getting back into the Alpine and doing some, really fun, easy, low stress climbing. We have some great climbs close to where I live that are, fourth class, low fifth class, the kind of things that, uh, it's a short approach on a nice trail, and then I can scamper up some solid, clean, dry rock and come back down, and the whole outing will only take a half a day, and I get the benefit of being in the mountains with the wildflowers and the views and just, the the break from everyday life that being in the mountains gives me without a lot of the stress of, can I lead this pitch or, what if I slip here? I'm gonna die. So that's honestly the thing that's helped me when I feel like I've had a loss of motivation is I tap into the things about the mountains that really kind of feed my soul.
No, that's great. And that's pretty much the same advice I would give. I mean, I think it is important to for this person, Brandon, to look at why are you doing this in the first place? Um, is it if it's something that's really fulfilling, satisfying to you, and you're doing it just for yourself, I think that you'll be able to, that motivation will return. If it's really coming from a place of enjoyment and love of the mountains or comradeship that you get with your partners, that sort of thing, then you just need a break. You just need to take a step back, do other things besides climb for a little while. If it's coming from an external source that you're trying to prove something or satisfy somebody else, then it's going to be much harder to find that. And I think that's not a good reason to go do dangerous things in the mountains. Unfortunately, there are lots of people who have done that. But I think that taking the break is the best possible thing for you.
Yeah, I always joke with folks that I guide that like, hey, we're not out here saving the world. We are not
Yeah,
even really making the world a better place. What
yeah,
we do is completely frivolous activity. I
yeah.
think it's healthy for our own spirit, and maybe that makes the world a slightly better place, but ultimately, it's kind of a folly what we do up there. And so if you
Yeah.
don't feel the motivation to do it, you should not feel any pressure to go do it.
Yeah, one of the athletes I coach, Ruth Croft, who's was second place at UTMB last year, and she's preparing and been training very well for UTMB this year. Just had an Instagram post that I really liked. I saw the other day. It's a picture of her, a black and white picture of her on a treadmill being tested. And there's all this hype now of her going into about her and other people getting ready for UTMB and potentially being one of the top athletes there. But in her post she said, after all, it is just running.
Yep.
Like you said, it is really not that important of a thing. I
Yep.
mean, it is important to us in the moment for this time, but when you need to step back and look at it big picture wise, and it's really not that big of a deal.
Yep.
Um,
That's great.
Okay, next question is another one for you, Larry.
Okay. Minimum maintenance dose of cardio during a sport climbing focused training block. Uh, well, you know, it's this a little bit hard to answer without having a little more of a background of this person's training history and sort of, what their overall training goals are. I mean, I would say in some ways, if you just want to climb hard sport routes, you probably don't need to be doing a ton of aerobic training
Yeah,
at all.
absolutely. Yeah,
But if you're trying to maintain some sort of balance for other endurance related sports, I think somewhere in that, you know, 4 to 6 hours a week is a pretty solid number to just maintain some aerobic base fitness.
yeah. But as we've said earlier, and well, we've talked about this before in other podcasts, is that if you're trying to climb hard, doing a bunch of aerobic base training is going to have a negative impact on that ability. And so, I think that the minimum dose isn't a good way to look at this. If your goal is to really be, climbing hard, doing hard climbing, then maybe you're not going to do any aerobic work. You're just going to rest between between climbing sessions, or maybe the approach to the bottom of the crag. Maybe it's a 15 and 20-minute approach to the crag, and that's your
There's your
aerobic work
minimum
for
dose.
the
Yeah.
week. That's it. I mean,
Yep.
um,
Walk slow.
yes. So. Okay, uh, let's see. Now, here's another question. Strength plan for a former strength athlete to endurance needing to lose muscle mass. I'm going to need to try to interpret that. Um, So a former strength athlete shifting to endurance, so that's why I'm reading this, but needing to lose muscle mass. Well, you will, if you're shifting to endurance and this gets back to that time and energy thing, you're going to probably have to, by virtue of the fact that you have limited time and limited energy, give up some of your strength training. And just doing that means you are going to begin to lose muscle mass if you're coming from a strength training background. Um, I what I find because we work with many military athletes, most of whom have come from a strength training background or bring a high level of strength when they engage with us, many of them are already much stronger than they actually need to be to do the job that they do at work. And so giving up some of their strength training, it's not uncommon for people who are really into strength training to spend, almost as much time in the gym doing strength training as we would have a runner out doing their running training, doing endurance training. So they might want to be dropping from, let's say, 6 hours a week in the gym, 4 days a week, to down to 2 days a week, an hour to an hour and a half each. Um, we often cut that in half, and we have seen, interestingly, and I don't understand the physiology of this. I think it's probably because strength is primarily a neurologic effect. Your brain's ability to recruit a bunch of muscle mass to create force. That once you've developed those motor pathways within the nervous system, they stay. I had a military athlete that I was training for one of the more maybe one of the most challenging selections into one of the special operations groups. And I worked with him for a year and a half where he did none of his normal strength training work. And what was amazing to me over the course of that time is that his deadlift, we tested his deadlift over the course of this year and a half. It didn't go down.
Yeah.
He could still deadlift at the end as much as he'd been able to deadlift at the beginning. So, and I can't explain that, but it flies in the face a little bit of what we read about, the strength training principles. But we do see on maybe a more reasonable scale that when we cut the strength training in roughly a half from people who have been used to doing a lot, they don't lose any strength. They're able to maintain. So I would say, you could consider cutting back quite a bit. Um, on that, roughly 50%. And you're going to lose some muscle mass, but you're probably not going to lose that much strength.
Yeah. Well, and losing muscle mass in a lot of ways is a good thing for an endurance athlete because you don't have to oxygenate all those extra
Yeah,
muscle.
you're not carrying it around. Yes. And as this, some of these, I've had a couple of these military guys who I've worked with, again, in the special operations world, who say, you know, it's really hard to pick up a 250-pound guy that's got body armor on and whatever. It's a lot easier. And those guys sometimes they can't fit through the window. They're too
Yeah.
big. They
Right.
can't get in. So there's
Yeah.
all these disadvantages of being that big. And like picking up the 170-pound guy with the body armor is going to be a lot more, it's going to be a lot easier to save that guy than to save the huge guy.
Yeah.
Um, so I've just listened to so many stories from these guys that it's helped me understand the demands of their job, which are incredibly difficult demands, um, and understand some of the shortcomings and the benefits of the way we have begun to change the conversation in that arena over the past several years.
Yeah.
Well, Larry, we have got a bunch more questions. We either better speed the hell up or we're going to have to do another podcast in a few days or a week. Um,
Okay, well, let me take on this next one here. If using a stock plan, how would you suggest building in time for technical skill acquisition? I think this is a great question because you know, when someone shows up for let's use the technical skills in terms of say mountaineering, uh, there's fitness and then there's efficiency or economy of movement, right? So those two things are kind of go hand in hand. So you could have somebody who's incredibly fit, but who can barely walk in crampons or, move through talus and uneven terrain, it's going to really struggle and move quite slowly. And then you can have somebody who is highly economical in moving on ice in crampons or through that rough terrain that doesn't have good fitness. So it does require somewhat of a balance of each of those things. So, so I think it's important to try to build in some time to gain technical skills. So, some examples would be if you're training for alpine climbing, then trying to get into the climbing gym periodically would be beneficial. As you mentioned earlier, trying to go in on, say, a recovery day would be a great time to spend some time working on those other skills. Uh, for our mountaineering athletes, we often, you know, many people live in these areas where they don't have a lot of access to vertical relief or outdoor trails. They do a huge amount of their training indoors on treadmills and stair machines. We try to encourage those folks to get outside at least one day a week, ideally on a rugged trail or even honestly off trail. Just, all the tiny little stabilizer muscles that you use when you're moving over uneven ground, those are really hard to train indoors where every step is identical to the step before. So I think there's a lot of value to learning to move your body through rough outdoor terrain. And, I think building that time in, whether it's incorporating, it into your training once a week. I do the drive. It's an hour and a half to get to some outside terrain, and the trails are so gentle and practically paved that I just go straight up the mountain cross country and I'll walk back down on the trail. Or if I'm training for an alpine climb, I'm going to make sure I get some climbing in, at least every couple of weeks to work on those skills as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be a real challenge, as you say, to develop the skills, especially if you live in a place that you don't have access to real, to alpine type terrain if you're training for mountaineering. Um, so yeah, and it's those are the best recommendations, I can think of. I mean, even if it means putting crampons on and go tromping around on like, an embankment on an interstate entrance ramp,
Yeah.
that just walking around on the grass, steep grass, getting used to having crampons on your feet. That can be, I had a guy who years ago he lived near a big earthen dam that they had covered with like, grapefruit sized boulders at the base of it to keep the earth in place. And he
Yep.
just went and walked back and forth and up and down all over these, nasty scree type stuff to develop some sort of the stability and the ankle strength that you need to walk on rough terrain. So you have to be a little more creative if you don't have access to it. But doing 100% of your training on, a stair machine, for instance, it will make you very fit, but you will probably be lacking the skills, the technical skills of moving in that kind of terrain.
Yeah.
Okay, next, how should a tactical athlete balance lifting while concurrently running up to around 40 miles per week? Well, congratulations as a tactical athlete running that much. That's great. Um, I would, two things. One is I would suggest breaking your strength training into two sessions per week. One that's maybe upper body focused and one that's lower body focused. I think that will still maintain and potentially even build enough strength for you. Then the other is do your strength training early in the day when you're fresh, so you can put a lot into it, and have that central nervous system fatigue we were talking about earlier isn't a factor, and do your running, on days when you're not doing strength training or later in the day, on the days you do strength training. Okay, next question is, do you need to apply the 80-20 ratio to rock climbing training with a progression in mind? Okay, I can't let this go by.
Okay.
This whole 80-20 thing is crazy. Um, And I'm going to blame it on this guy who's a very prolific writer and quite a good writer. This guy named Matt Fitzgerald, who's written these books called 80/20. Well, this came about because the 80/20 idea came about from a study that Stephen Seiler did. I've spoken and written about it many, many times in the late 2000, early 2000s. And what he did was he looked at the training that elites did across the full spectrum of endurance sports. This was including, rowing, paddling, cycling, running, swimming, cross-country skiing. And he looked at all these world champions and he said, what are the commonalities in the way these people train? How is their training made up? And here's where here's where the misinterpretation was made, I believe, by Matt Fitzgerald. Stephen Seiler has since come out to kind of explain and correct this misunderstanding, but it's still this 80/20 thing is still stuck in people's the kind of the popular culture. When he looked at their training, he noticed that 80% of the training sessions were devoted to low intensity training, and 20% of the training sessions were devoted to higher intensity sessions. So there's this 80/20 ratio. But that's the number of sessions. That is not the volume of training. So by virtue of the fact that the low intensity training sessions are generally much longer than the high intensity training sessions, the actual volume ratio is about 90/10. And so that is what you should really be thinking about in the correct way. And unfortunately, I don't think Matt Fitzgerald, I mean, he's making a tremendous living off of this 80/20 notion, but he hasn't explained to people, no, it's not the number of hours you spend, it's the number of sessions. So I probably just made an enemy out of him with this.
Yeah.
But I do want to clarify it. So the 90/10 ratio designed for endurance or was discovered by Seiler in endurance sports. And it has been, demonstrated over and over again that that's pretty much how endurance athletes train. Now, I don't consider, most rock climbing doesn't really qualify as an endurance sport. Yes, there are endurance-y sections of certain pitches, but those might last just a few minutes. And the type of endurance training you'd be doing for those is more what we would think of as like muscular endurance training rather than, getting, going and then let's say running for 3 hours. They're quite different. So I don't know that you should even think about applying that because rock climbing training is by its very nature going to be done at a much higher intensity than, let's say, training for mountaineering or a 100-mile race. So I don't think that's an effective model to keep in mind. You do need some very hard climbing, and you need a bunch of easier climbing. Um, you know, but I don't know that the ratio could be 90/10. I don't know what that would be. I'm not an expert in rock climbing training.
Well, and I would also say with rock climbing training, it's going to be very different if you're trying to red point 513 or 515, or if you're trying to climb the nose in a day, right?
Yeah.
That's where you might need some real endurance. And so there is a difference in, even rock climbing endurance when it comes to climbing a 60-meter overhanging pitch that, it's really pumpy and hard compared to climbing 3,500 feet of technical rock,
Yeah.
and not having your arms just die halfway up.
Yeah. Good point. Thank you. Um,
Yeah.
okay, next question is, I am a newcomer to skate cross-country skiing. How do I progress in endurance for it? Well, in the summertime, probably the best thing you could be doing would be to roller ski. General endurance you can build through running, hiking, that sort of thing. But the balance and technical skills and the endurance that goes along with it, skating is a very different motion than the classic diagonal stride technique in cross-country skiing. Um, which looks a little bit like running. So, cross-country skiers historically have used to be quite good runners because running transferred over pretty well to classic skiing. But with the advent of skating in the early mid 80s, that doesn't look at all like running. And so running for aerobic base training is still a good thing, but you do need to do something that is more specific. Now, the problem with roller skiing is it's quite dangerous. When you fall on pavement. And so I don't normally recommend that to people who are just getting into cross-country skiing. Rollerblading is another way of getting some of that same kind of lateral pushing movement. The other thing I would recommend is a muscular endurance program that involves lateral pushing. So, like, sideways box steps would be, a good way to develop some of that muscular endurance. Um, and then the other thing is you just need to skate a lot in the wintertime. Now, something about cross-country skiing that doesn't often get enough attention is the technicality of it. It is a highly technical sport. So a good skier, whether it's skating or classic technique, is just going to use a lot less energy than a newcomer because the newcomer is trying to maintain their balance. And so when you think about it, it's probably one of the more technically challenging and maybe the most technically challenging endurance sports because you're standing on a 2-inch wide ski that is moving at, maybe 20 miles an hour. You're having to balance on it and then apply a force to keep yourself moving. And there's not too many other sports. I mean, swimming is an incredibly technical sport, but you're not having to balance in swimming. Whereas this one, you have to actually balance because you're standing up. So I would say if you really want to progress as a newcomer in any kind of cross-country skiing technique, you need to connect with someone who can give you good lessons and technique because you're gonna make way bigger gains there than worrying about fitness. The fitness will come as you become a better skier. But I think that's where you should spend your time, spend some money or get involved with a club or, somebody who can give you lessons. Because what Larry can say has seen this too, where Larry lives and I used to live, there's a lot of cross-country skiers there in the wintertime. And we often see people who are quite new to the sport. And it's painful to watch sometimes the struggles that these people are having. And it's often very fit. They're coming from a cycling or a running background. They're very fit people, but they can hardly move forward. So get yourself some lessons would be my guess, my first suggestion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I used to teach Nordic skiing here in the valley, and yeah, the dramatic decrease in effort it takes to move yourself on skate skis when you have good technique is just phenomenal. Like
Yeah.
people, and it's a very non-intuitive movement pattern. So I feel like, the worst possible thing you could do is try to teach yourself how to do it because yeah, it's quite nuanced in terms of the timing and the weight transfer. And so starting out, especially if you are truly a newcomer, get a good foundation with starting out with lessons so that your technique is good out of the gate. And then once you have good technique, just doing more of it is going to help you build endurance for it. And you can't get any more specific than that.
Everyone, that's all we have time for this month. There's still several more very detailed questions that we would love to answer, but this has kind of run long. Maybe it's because we've been talking too much, but I do think people appreciate the depth we're willing to go to help them. So we'll wrap this up here. We'll do another follow up with Larry and me next month. Well, I think I'm going to be away partly at UTMB and taking a little vacation. So probably middle of September, you can count on us doing another one of these. And in the meantime, we'll collect a few more questions, but there are a lot more, and some of these next questions are quite long. So we really do appreciate the interest people are showing in this. It's very rewarding to know that people are curious about these things. And as Larry said in the beginning, some of these questions have people, it shows that people are we're not getting all these questions that we used to get about how do I evaluate my aerobic threshold. Like those we used to get a couple of years ago. Now we're getting really detailed, some that are quite complicated. Um, and for those that are, if you're not getting the satisfaction of our from our answer, or for some of these extremely down in the weeds type of questions, and we do offer phone consultations. They're not free, but I think they would, in many cases, they would give you a better understanding. We could go into the weeds with you because we'd be able to ask questions then of the specifics of what you're trying to get out of it. So feel free to reach out to us there as well. We do also answer questions on the forum, although I don't get a chance to keep the forum up to date more than usually 3 or 4 times a month. So it might take a little while to get an answer there. But I want to just close by saying we really appreciate everyone that has been writing into us, and we hope this has been helpful. And Larry, I guess you and I'll have to go get together again in a month and do this again.
Yeah, I look forward to it, Scott. It's always fun to talk about this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And we'll see everybody else in a month.
Okay, happy training.